In the last part of this lesson, we considered the ideas of Nikolai Danilevsky, and in this part, we're going to move on to the ideas of Oswald Spengler, who took Danilevsky very seriously and built on his ideas. So, for Spengler, there was no world history, just the history of individual civilizations, and also no overall growth of human understanding. So there's no overall progress, whether social progress or intellectual progress. There is no progress. And that kind of conflicts with the way people tend to think about things. So people have traditionally tended to think that European or Western civilization has grown out of Greco-Roman or classical civilization and has improved on it and made progress from it, that things have, we've got a better understanding of the natural world, and we would think that the scientific advances that we have made are just objectively true and will be the basis for all future human knowledge. But Spengler is saying, no, that's not the case. Western civilization is just another civilization in its own right. It's not an evolution or development of, and let alone an improvement upon classical civilization. Classical civilization has gone and Western civilization is now in existence, but there's no relationship between them. And also that our science is not the true science that will last for all time, and it's not based on previous science. It's just a characteristically Western scientific view, characteristically Western view of the world, which is what we call science. And so following on from Danilevsky, he suggested that the Western civilization is characterized by a Faustian mindset. So we saw how Danilevsky suggested that British civilization is based on the idea of the struggle for existence and survival of the fittest. And Spengler says, well, this is the European point of view, though he called it Faustian, so based on the myth of Dr. Faustus, who sells his soul to the devil because of his thirst for knowledge. So and knowledge is power. So Spengler is characterizing the Western outlook on life, the Western worldview, as about mastery of the universe, knowledge, and power over nature. And but that's not a necessary view. That's just, other civilizations don't have that, but that is the Western outlook, he is saying. So he says, as an example of that Darwin is really just an expression of the ideas of the philosopher Schopenhauer, who was a figure of the first half of the 19th century. So in Schopenhauer, there is the idea that the universe, the fundamental sort of force in the universe is the will. And it's about the drive for existence. And for Schopenhauer, this is a mindless thing. It's mindless, it's purposeless. So there's no guiding rational divinity, no God. But just life itself has a drive to exist, but it's not for any particular purpose, and it's not guided by anything. And so that's Schopenhauer's philosophy, or part of it. And so what Spengler pointing out is, well, Darwin is really just an expression of these ideas applied to the natural world. And so it's not really an original biological theory, it's just an expression of this Faustian mindset of Western civilization. And he said another aspect of the Faustian point of view is the belief in infinite space. Infinite space. And one example where we can see this is in the West's religious architecture, in cathedrals. Cathedrals are huge buildings that enclose a vast amount of empty space. So let's put up some pictures that illustrate this. So here is a Western cathedral, Lincoln Cathedral, which is, as I say, characterized by these vast ceilings enclosing as much space as possible. And this expresses the Western belief in infinite space, or Western interest in infinite space. But over here we have a classical temple of the Greco-Roman civilization, and this is a separate civilization for Spengler. It's the classical civilization, and here it's all about, he said, corporeality, corporateness, to do with the body, was what characterized classical civilization. So things are compact, solid, congested. So in this temple, all these columns are close together, and inside them there's not empty space but further rooms and constructions. And then over here we have what Spengler called the Magian civilization, or the Arabian civilization, which he said was characterized by the idea of a cavern or a tent. So its approach to space is that it's enclosing space in a kind of domestication of space, or a womb-like space. So it's kind of cozy in there. And that's what we see in this mosque. And so Spengler would say that the reason that Western civilization came up with the idea of perspective in art, the laws of perspective, is because of its concern with infinite space. So it thought about the way parallel lines meet at infinity, and thought about vast distances, and so tried to create perspective and a sense of distance. And the fact that other civilizations, such as Chinese civilization or Egyptian civilization, didn't come up with the ideas of perspective, is not because they're backward or because they're less advanced in some way, but is just because they have a different mental outlook. They've got a different civilizational world picture. And so they did different things with their art. But because they weren't thinking about infinite space, they had no desire to represent distance in their art. And then Spengler would go so far as to say beyond this, that our ideas about the universe are also just a characteristically Western worldview. So we see the universe, or the Western world sees the universe as vast, with enormous distances between stars. Well, that is just the same as we see in the architecture. It's all about vast space, great distance. But in the classical civilization, which has had ideas that were, or thought about things in a way that was congested and compact, their idea or model of the universe was of a series of closely packed crystal spheres. So, we had the Earth at the center, and then the planets and the stars at the outside. But all these spheres were very closely packed, congested, just like their temples. And the Magian or Arabian civilization, with its idea of the cavern, thought about the universe, the sky, in terms of a dome, like a tent or a cavern again, with the stars stuck on it. And so it's no coincidence that the medieval Arabs members of the Magian civilization did a lot of work on spherical trigonometry, so thinking about measuring angles between stars and angles on this celestial sphere, and our dependence on that work they did on spherical trigonometry on the celestial sphere is shown in the way we still use the words that they invented. So things like azimuth and an almanac and the zenith, these are all Arabic words because it was the Magian perspective that thought about the universe as this celestial sphere. But the Western world, and so if we've got the congested world of the classical civilization, then the Western one is of these galaxies, huge galaxies at vast distances from the Earth. But Spengler would go so far as to say, very provocatively, that this is not true. It's not the way it is. It's just any more than this is true or the way it is, or any more than this is true or the way it is. It's just a way of thinking about it. All the civilizations see the same thing at the end of the day. They see dots of light in the night sky, but they think about them in different ways. And because we have a bias to thinking about things in terms of infinite space, we think about the cosmos in terms of infinite space. So let's get rid of these and move on to Spengler's idea about the life cycle of a civilization. So Spengler agreed with Danilevsky again that a civilization is a one-shot experiment. It only goes once through its life cycle. It rises and then falls. But he divided it into the 4 seasons: spring, summer, autumn and winter. And he saw a civilization also as having a preliminary period, a gestational period, you could say here the gestation of the civilization, which he called its Merovingian period. The Merovingians were a dynasty who ruled in France and parts of Germany and Switzerland in the period after the fall of the Western Roman Empire and before the beginnings of the High Middle Ages. So in the sort of the European Dark Ages. So in the Merovingian period, he said that Western civilization hadn't really got started, but it got started in the medieval period proper, the high medieval period. So today historians would call that the early medieval period to avoid using the term Dark Age. So Spengler, it's only when we get into the medieval period proper, the Middle and High Middle Ages, that the civilization got started. Then it went through the spring, summer, autumn and winter, and the spring period is characterized in his view by it's spring because it's the blossoming of the civilization. There's a strong religion in the spring period, and there's monumental architecture. And particularly monumental religious architecture. So for Western civilization, this is the cathedral age, the time of the building of the cathedrals for several centuries. So that was the spring for Western civilization. And then we move on to the summer, which is characterized by a sort of flourishing of scholarship, an analytical approach to the world, and also feudalism. So by feudalism, we've covered it before, but we mean a socio-political structure in which the king controls his nobility, or his high nobility, and the high nobility control the lower nobility, and the lower nobility control maybe another layer below, and it eventually gets to those who control the peasants. So the king doesn't directly tax the peasants, he taxes the high nobility tax the low nobility, and so on down. So also the king doesn't raise an army directly from the peasants, but the king's nobles have a responsibility to provide contingents to the king's army. So the government doesn't interact directly with the population. There are these layers, these hierarchical layers of political authority. And so this is, for Western civilization, the time of the late Middle Ages, the Renaissance and the Reformation. And this, in general, in the life cycle of the civilization, is also the time of the first cities really emerging. So we've got towns here, but the first cities start to grow at this point. And then next, moving to the autumn, this is a time when humanist ideas start to arise. So that's ideas of, individual freedom, justice, equality, caring for the common man, the common person. And society at this point is becoming more secular and more rational. So, faith, religion is starting to wane, and secular ideas and reason are becoming more important. And so in Western civilization, this would correspond to the time of the Enlightenment and the emergence of parliaments. So, where people are starting, or the idea is growing, that people should have a say in how they are ruled. And then we move on to the winter, which is characterized by the emergence of very large cities, and the people living in them. Then there's no sense of community. We've got the disconnected masses. And this is a time when materialism takes root in the civilization, and commercialism. So any sort of higher philosophical ideas, falling out of fashion, and people are really just concerned with their everyday life and living a luxurious and materialist life. And commercialism, buying and selling almost as it were for the sake of it. So people today, for example, complain about, we have 23 different varieties of breakfast cereal to choose from in the supermarket. Do we really need that number? So for Spengler, the winter is characterized by that. So in Western civilization, this is the Industrial Revolution and thereafter to today. And for Spengler, writing in the 1920s, the future coming technological civilization. And then that comes to an end. This is the winter, and the society is clearly in decline, and people are disconnected, and the civilization as a whole is becoming incapable of any real innovation or creativity. People are just materialist and commercialist and disconnected. They can't organise to make any significant achievements, do any significant things. And so this takes the society, or civilization rather, into its fellahin stage, as Spengler called it. So these are just leaderless peasants. So here Spengler was thinking about the Arabian or Magian civilization of his day, which he saw as having completed its life cycle. And the fellahin is a term for the peasants of places like Egypt. in the Arab world, fellahin, who are just peasants working the land, but living day to day, but incapable of any sort of higher purpose or activity, as he saw it. And the civilization can then just continue like that forever, or until it's conquered and destroyed by some outsider, some more vigorous civilization. And in fact, Spengler was a bit specific about using, for this period, he didn't call it a civilization, he called this the culture stage. At this point, it's a culture. So it's a set of beliefs, a worldview. This worldview is kind of germinating here, and this is where it's starting to flourish. And so it's a culture, a set of ideas, but it's not yet a civilization. It only becomes a civilization here. And I suppose he made this distinction because he argued that at this point, the power in the society, we'll call it that, since he's saying that it's not a civilization at this stage, the power is based in the countryside. So power is based on land, and most people are in the countryside, and the lords, the powerful people in the country, are those who control these vast estates in the country. So let's write that. Power in the countryside. And then in the civilization stage, he said power moves into the cities. So this is where cities come into play, and since the word cities is kind of related to civilization, which is based on the word for citizen, so we now have cities, so he's prepared to call it a civilization. So the power is in the cities here. And so if we put here that the power is with the lords, then here the power is with the bourgeoisie. So power in the cities means now the power is with the entrepreneurs, the traders, the factory owners, and also the members of parliament. So power is now exercised in parliament, and so it's the political entrepreneurs who have power. So power is no longer based on land, it's based on connections and economic and political activity. And to illustrate his ideas, Spengler presents a number of charts in which he lines up different civilizations and shows that they went through the same processes, so that the same issues arose at the corresponding points in each civilization. So this is one of his charts, or a simplified version of one of his charts. And we've got here the Indian civilization, the classical civilization, the Magian or Arabian civilization, and the Western civilization. And he thought that the Indian and classical civilizations got started around about 1500 BC, the Magian civilization from the time of Christ, and the Western civilization from AD 900. And I've put here some sort of headings of the different stages that Spengler has, and how these correspond to the different seasons: spring, summer, autumn and winter. And Spengler thought that the whole process of a civilization from start to finish lasted around about 1,000 years, maybe a little bit more, 1,200 years, or it could be longer, but 1,000 and a bit years. And just to illustrate then some of his arguments about how they're going through similar although they get started at different stages, they go through similar processes at the corresponding points in their life cycle. So, for example, he identifies one key stage in the evolution of the ideas of a civilization as the Reformation, which is about internal popular opposition to the existing ideology, the existing faith. So we've got here in the Western civilization people like Hus, Luther and Calvin, the proponents of the Reformation. And in the Magian civilization he sees that as corresponding to the Nestorians and Monophysites, who rejected the idea of the Trinity and insisted on the unity of God. And he suggests that in classical civilization the cults of Orpheus and Dionysus were a reaction against the preceding, mythological ideas. And in the Indian civilization he's got the Brahmanas as their example of a reformation. And then again, looking through here in the Western civilization, the Reformation led on to movements like Puritanism and the Jansenists, and he compares that in the Magian civilization. It similarly evolved to the foundation of Islam, Muhammad, and iconoclasm. The idea in Islam that you shouldn't represent the figure, the pictures of people, and certainly not of the Prophet. And iconoclasm was about destroying images, which the Islamic civilization or Islamic people did. But in fact it was not just in the world of Islam, but also in the still Christian Byzantium, but he saw that as part of the Magian civilization rather than part of Western civilization. Byzantium or Constantinople in Turkey he saw as part of that. So even though they were different faiths, the same kind of movement gripped them of destroying images. And similarly, the Puritans, you can go into English cathedrals and see statues that have been defaced. And it's due to the Puritans at the time that they controlled those regions in the Civil War. They took out all the images, the saints' images in the church. Well, this happened in the Reformation, but it also happened more violently in the time of the English Civil War when the Puritans were in charge. And here you can see he includes mathematical ideas as part of the ideology, the worldview of a civilization. So he says that one phase that happens during the summer of a civilization is it comes up with a new mathematical conception of number. Now, for the Indian civilization, he didn't know what that was. The information was lost, he said. But in the classical civilization, ideas of geometry and arithmetic came in. And then at the corresponding point in the Magian civilization, the Arabian civilization, they came up with algebra. And then in Western civilization, ideas of functions and what we now call analysis. So a new way of thinking about mathematical operations here. And then moving here on into the autumn comes the zenith of the mathematical thought. So in the Indian civilization, they came up with the concept of zero at this point here. And in the classical civilization, the idea of conic sections, circles, ellipses, parabolas and hyperbolas and their properties. And in the Magian civilization, this was when spherical trigonometry underwent great development. And in the Western civilization, the idea of the infinitesimal or calculus. So this table is about the ideology, the ideas of a civilization. So starting with its mythology, developing into more formal kinds of religion, the Reformation, when religion becomes more rational, also mixing it with the mathematical ideas. And he also has other tables for example, political events in civilizations. So there he lines up different figures in different civilizations and shows that they had the same kind of impact on their own civilization, but in different civilizations. So, for example, he compares the Emperor Augustus, the first emperor of Rome, with the Emperor Shi Huang, or Shi Huangdi, sometimes called, the first emperor of China. Shows that they appeared at similar points in the evolution or development of those, the Chinese versus the Western, sorry, Chinese versus the classical civilizations. They appeared at the same point and they had the same kind of impact. And one last point to note from this table is that Spengler traces the evolution of classical civilization through to the emergence of Stoicism, which is round about the time of Christ, or in the last few centuries BC. So, and that's the end of the winter for classical civilization. So Spengler saw classical civilization as already come to its end and had no further potential for development, just at the time that the Roman Empire was getting started. So the Roman Empire occurred, or the Roman Empire under Augustus and the later emperors occurred in a civilization that was already exhausted its potential for growth in Spengler's view. So if Western civilization is going through the same point, and he sees it ethical socialism as the kind of corresponding movement within Western civilization that is becoming established in the 20th and 21st century, and if it comes to an end, so Western civilization reaches the end of this development, it could still carry on as and think it's an empire, Western empire or something, could still grow, just as the Roman Empire still grew out of this civilization that had completed its development. When Western civilization completes its development, things can still happen afterwards, but it's not very innovative. So Roman civilization didn't really bring in any new ideas. It relied on things that had already been developed, particularly in the Greek civilization. Perhaps one last point to mention is the work of the anthropologist J.S. Lee, who has studied cycles in Chinese civilization and not consciously emulating Spengler, but his work shows that there are two great cycles in Chinese history, each about 800 years, so corresponding roughly to Spengler's 1,000-year duration, and that those started with a new set of religious ideas and also a new foundation of new religious monumental architecture, which is, as we saw, one of the features of the springtime of a civilization, according to Spengler. So, and Lee shows how in these two great cycles of Chinese civilization, there's a kind of a matching process in each one. Similar things happened at similar points. So, because he wasn't consciously, as far as I know, emulating Spengler, it could be seen as a kind of independent confirmation, if you like, of Spengler's ideas.